In 2022, Shell and BP generated a combined staggering profit of nearly $68 billion. These two titans of energy control massive portions of the global economic infrastructure every single day. To understand the hidden wars behind global wealth, subscribe to Market Legends today. Welcome to the untold history of global energy. Subscribe to Market Legends for historical insights. The relentless pursuit of oil has historically dictated the fate of modern human civilization entirely. Before petroleum became the lifeblood of nations, kerosene was primarily used for simple household illumination. John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil monopoly ruthlessly dominated the late 19th century. The American giant fiercely controlled the vital flow of kerosene to almost every populated continent. However, a highly ambitious merchant in London envisioned a completely different global energy future. Marcus Samuel ran an import business successfully selling exotic painted seashells to wealthy Victorian families. He recognized that the distant Russian oil fields in Baku offered massive, totally untapped potential. The heavily monopolized market required a brilliant logistical breakthrough to challenge Standard Oil effectively. Samuel covertly commissioned the massive construction of the world's first true ocean-going oil tanker. The Murex sailed through the Suez Canal safely, carrying thousands of tons of volatile kerosene. This single revolutionary voyage permanently shattered the absolute global monopoly of American Standard Oil. Samuel proudly named his rapidly expanding new enterprise the Shell Transport and Trading Company. He painted his massive transport ships bright red to establish instant, undeniable global brand recognition. Simultaneously, a vastly different corporate empire was being born, deep in the scorching Persian desert. A wealthy Englishman named William Knox Darcy gambled his massive fortune on Middle Eastern oil. Darcy paid the Shah of Persia £20,000 for highly exclusive regional exploration rights. For years, his exhausted drilling teams found absolutely nothing in the scorching, unforgiving desert sands. By 1908, Darcy was completely bankrupt and totally ready to abandon the expensive Persian project. Just weeks before cancellation, a massive geyser of crude oil violently erupted in Masjid-e-Suleiman. This historic, unprecedented strike officially birthed the massive Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later becoming BP. Anglo-Persian was fundamentally different from Shell because it was deeply intertwined with sovereign government power. The British Royal Navy desperately needed a superior, highly reliable fuel source for its battleships. Winston Churchill boldly decided to quickly transition the entire naval fleet from coal to oil. This monumental military decision required a totally secure, heavily protected, continuous supply of liquid petroleum. The British government quietly purchased a massive controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The corporate boardroom officially became an active, highly classified extension of British foreign policy globally. Shell, meanwhile, aggressively merged with Royal Dutch to form a massive, unstoppable European corporate syndicate. Henry de Terting, a ruthless Dutch executive, masterfully led this newly formed global corporate alliance. De Terting systematically and aggressively acquired vital oil production assets across the entire Dutch East Indies. The global stage was firmly set for a vicious, highly competitive, century-long international corporate conflict. When World War I erupted, oil instantly became the undisputed currency of global military survival. Heavily armored tanks, agile airplanes, and massive naval dreadnoughts completely relied on continuous petroleum supplies. Lord Curzon famously declared that the Allied forces floated to global victory upon a wave of oil. Shell provided the British military with absolutely crucial, highly explosive aviation fuel and heavy munitions. Anglo-Persian pumped millions of vital gallons directly from their highly guarded Middle Eastern desert wells. The devastating war proved unequivocally that national security required absolute dominance over global petroleum. During the ensuing peace, the global demand for gasoline-fueled consumer automobiles exploded exponentially. Shell quickly established a massive, highly visible network of bright yellow, roadside retail filling stations. They brilliantly marketed their premium fuel directly to the rapidly growing middle class of motorists. Anglo-Persian expanded their global reach by fiercely competing for heavily contested international retail market share. They officially rebranded their sprawling international retail operations under the recognizable British Petroleum brand name. The Middle East quickly became the ultimate geopolitical prize for these massive, aggressive corporate titans. The 1928 Red Line Agreement attempted to peacefully divide the massive Arabian oil wealth securely. Major oil companies essentially drew a thick red line across a map of the entire region. They agreed to strictly share petroleum production without aggressively competing against each other locally. This highly secretive corporate cartel actively manipulated global oil prices to guarantee immense corporate profitability. World War II fundamentally accelerated the absolutely critical, desperate need for massive global petroleum reserves. Control over distant oil fields repeatedly dictated the complex tactical strategies of opposing military armies. German forces launched massive, devastating military campaigns aimed specifically at securing vital Russian oil supplies. Shell and BP facilities were frequently targeted and heavily bombed during relentless aerial military campaigns. Following the Allied victory, the global economic landscape underwent a massive, totally unprecedented structural transformation. The post-war global economic boom heavily relied on the incredibly cheap, seemingly infinite oil supply. Anglo-Persian, now named Anglo-Iranian, completely controlled the largest oil refinery globally in the city of Abadan. Their massive corporate profits flowed directly to London, leaving the impoverished Iranian population deeply resentful. In 1951, the Iranian government boldly decided to fully nationalize their highly lucrative domestic oil industry. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh directly challenged the absolute financial supremacy of the powerful British Empire. This bold political move essentially expelled the massive British oil giant from its original birthplace. The British government immediately orchestrated a devastating, highly effective global economic boycott of Iranian oil. Shell aggressively capitalized on this geopolitical crisis by rapidly increasing production in other global regions. The crippling Iranian economic blockade eventually culminated in a highly controversial, secretly orchestrated military coup. The CIA and British intelligence successfully overthrew the democratically elected leader to restore absolute corporate control. Following the violent coup, the returning British oil entity was officially renamed simply as BP. They were forcefully required to share the lucrative Iranian oil wealth with an international corporate consortium. Shell was prominently included in this new, highly profitable, carefully structured Middle Eastern corporate alliance. The 1960s brought a completely new, massive geopolitical threat to the established Western oil dominance. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was officially formed to assert absolute sovereign control. OPEC fundamentally shifted the massive balance of power away from the massive Western corporate giants. Developing nations demanded a significantly larger, fairer share of their own natural resource wealth permanently. The 1973 oil embargo completely shocked the fragile, highly dependent Western global economic financial system. Global petroleum prices quadrupled almost overnight, causing massive, unprecedented widespread economic panic and international inflation. Shell and BP quickly realized they could no longer rely exclusively on cheap Middle Eastern crude. They desperately needed to discover massive, completely secure oil reserves far outside of OPEC territory. This urgent strategic necessity drove both powerful companies into the freezing, treacherous waters of the North Sea. Drilling in the incredibly violent North Sea environment required massive, totally unprecedented engineering and technological innovation. BP successfully discovered the massive Forties oil field deep beneath the crashing, freezing ocean waves. Shell countered by identifying the incredibly lucrative, massively productive Brent crude oil field located nearby. They constructed colossal, heavily reinforced steel platforms that could withstand 100-foot rogue ocean waves easily. The massive North Sea discoveries completely saved the British economy during a severe national financial crisis. It provided BP and Shell with a massive, highly secure domestic supply of premium liquid petroleum. The companies also aggressively expanded their complex drilling operations into the freezing, desolate Alaskan wilderness. BP heavily invested in the massive, incredibly challenging Prudhoe Bay oilfield development megaproject. They helped construct the massive Trans-Alaska pipeline across hundreds of miles of frozen, unforgiving tundra. Shell pushed technological boundaries by developing highly advanced, massive deep-water offshore drilling platform capabilities globally. The 1990s witnessed a massive wave of historic, unprecedented mega-mergers across the entire energy industry. BP aggressively acquired the American oil giant Amoco for a staggering $48 billion entirely in stock. This massive, unprecedented corporate buyout completely transformed BP into a truly global supermajor corporate powerhouse. Shell maintained its massive, highly decentralized global corporate structure to fiercely protect its international market share. Both companies generated hundreds of billions in massive annual revenues through relentless, highly aggressive global expansion. They seamlessly integrated the entire supply chain from deep-water offshore extraction to local neighborhood retail. The incredibly lucrative global oil war was no longer just about discovering new massive petroleum fields. It was increasingly about managing massive, highly complex global logistics and fiercely defending fragile corporate reputations. The dawn of the 21st century brought an entirely new, highly unpredictable set of corporate challenges. Environmental awareness was rapidly growing, fundamentally threatening the core, highly profitable business model of the giants. Global climate change discussions placed massive, unprecedented public pressure directly on the entire fossil fuel industry. BP boldly attempted a massive, highly publicized corporate rebranding campaign to address these urgent environmental concerns. They officially changed their iconic shield logo to a bright, vibrant green and yellow sunburst design. The company aggressively marketed themselves using the highly memorable, heavily broadcasted slogan, "Beyond Petroleum globally." They invested heavily in solar energy and heavily promoted their massive corporate commitment to renewable resources. Shell similarly published extensive, highly detailed sustainability reports outlining their future green energy corporate transitions. However, the vast majority of their massive corporate capital remained fiercely dedicated to traditional liquid oil. The fundamental, undeniable global reality was that global consumer demand for petroleum was still actively skyrocketing. Developing nations required massive, unprecedented amounts of reliable energy for incredibly rapid, massive national industrialization. Both corporate titans aggressively pursued highly controversial, technically difficult, unconventional global oil extraction methods continuously. Shell heavily invested billions into the massive, environmentally complex Canadian oil sands extraction megaprojects. The industrial process of separating thick bitumen from sand was incredibly expensive and heavily carbon-intensive. BP focused massive corporate resources on ultra-deepwater drilling in the highly volatile Gulf of Mexico. They pushed advanced marine engineering technology to its absolute, highly dangerous physical breaking point continuously. This relentless, aggressive pursuit of deepwater crude ultimately resulted in a massive, unprecedented, tragic corporate catastrophe. In April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig suffered a massive catastrophic blowout and massive explosion. 11 crew members tragically perished in the massive, devastating inferno that totally consumed the massive rig. For 87 agonizing days, millions of gallons of toxic crude oil continuously poured into the fragile ocean. The environmental devastation across the fragile Gulf Coast ecosystem was absolutely unprecedented and completely heartbreaking globally. BP faced massive, intense global outrage and totally unprecedented, heavily damaging media scrutiny every single day. The incredibly disastrous marine spill cost the company over $65 billion in massive legal penalties. It completely destroyed the carefully constructed, highly expensive, beyond petroleum environmentally friendly corporate marketing narrative. The company was forced to aggressively sell off massive, highly profitable global assets to survive financially. Shell quietly watched their massive corporate rivals struggle through the devastating, incredibly expensive legal nightmare continuously. However, Shell was certainly not entirely immune to massive, highly damaging environmental controversies themselves historically. Their extensive, highly profitable oil operations in the Nigerian Delta faced massive, continuous, fierce public protests. Frequent pipeline leaks caused massive, devastating environmental damage to the local agricultural farming communities repeatedly. The company faced massive, highly publicized international lawsuits regarding their complex, highly controversial Nigerian environmental legacy. They also boldly attempted a massive, incredibly expensive exploratory drilling campaign in the freezing Arctic Ocean. Shell spent over $7 billion aggressively preparing to drill in the treacherous, freezing Chukchi Sea. Environmental activists aggressively launched massive, highly coordinated global protests to successfully stop the dangerous Arctic project. Facing massive logistical failures and fierce public opposition, Shell ultimately abandoned the highly costly Arctic endeavor. The 2014 global collapse in oil prices fundamentally shocked the entire, massively interconnected energy industry completely. The rapid, massive expansion of American shale fracking had flooded the global market with cheap petroleum. Corporate revenues plummeted rapidly, forcing both Shell and BP to aggressively execute massive, painful workforce layoffs. They aggressively slashed massive capital expenditure budgets and delayed expensive, highly complex future drilling megaprojects. To ensure long-term corporate survival, Shell orchestrated a massive, highly strategic, aggressive corporate acquisition flawlessly. In 2016, they successfully purchased the massive British gas giant BG Group for $53 billion. This massive, unprecedented corporate buyout significantly expanded Shell's highly lucrative global liquefied natural gas portfolio immediately. Natural gas was heavily promoted as a cleaner, highly efficient bridge fuel toward totally renewable energy. BP also aggressively pivoted toward expanding their massive natural gas operations globally to fiercely maintain profitability. The devastating 2020 global pandemic introduced a completely unprecedented, massive disruption to global energy markets instantly. Global transportation halted completely, causing worldwide oil demand to absolutely crash in a matter of weeks. For a brief historic moment, the official price of American crude oil actually turned completely negative. Both Shell and BP reported massive, absolutely historic financial losses during the highly chaotic pandemic year. The severe global crisis forcefully accelerated their respective, highly publicized corporate transitions toward green, renewable energy. BP aggressively announced a massive, highly ambitious plan to heavily reduce overall oil and gas production. They pledged to invest billions actively into massive offshore wind farms and electric vehicle charging networks. Shell similarly outlined a massive, highly complex corporate strategy to achieve net zero carbon emissions eventually. However, the subsequent geopolitical crisis in Eastern Europe rapidly altered the complex global energy landscape again. The 2022 conflict completely disrupted heavily reliant global supply chains and massively restricted Russian natural gas. global energy security instantly became the absolute highest geopolitical priority for heavily dependent Western sovereign nations. Petroleum and natural gas prices actively surged to absolutely historic, totally unprecedented, massive global market highs. Shell and BP suddenly generated massive, absolutely record-breaking profits despite their aggressive green energy corporate pledges. This massive financial windfall created severe, highly contentious political debates regarding windfall corporate taxes globally. Critics aggressively argued that the massive companies were unfairly profiting from a devastating international geopolitical crisis. The corporate titans aggressively defended their massive earnings as absolutely necessary for funding future energy transitions. They actively balanced the massive, immediate demand for reliable fossil fuels against long-term climate goals continuously. The intense historic rivalry between Shell and BP has continuously shaped the modern industrialized world profoundly. From the dusty Persian deserts to the freezing, treacherous depths of the violent North Sea continuously. They have continuously supplied the vital, highly combustible energy that actively fuels entire, powerful sovereign nations. Their massive corporate histories are deeply, permanently intertwined with devastating wars and massive global economic booms. They actively survived global monopolistic threats, aggressive nationalizations, and massive, unprecedented, catastrophic environmental disasters completely. Today, they face their absolute greatest, most complex corporate challenge in their entire, massive commercial history. They must successfully transition their massive, deeply entrenched business models entirely away from traditional fossil fuels. The massive transition requires completely unprecedented, highly aggressive investments into totally unproven green, renewable energy technologies. Shell leverages its massive, highly lucrative natural gas portfolio and aggressive global retail presence actively, continuously. BP leans heavily into its massive, highly ambitious offshore wind and active solar energy corporate investments. The ultimate corporate victor in this massive, ongoing corporate war will completely dominate the next century. The incredible corporate journey from exotic seashells to deepwater massive offshore drilling is absolutely astonishing historically. The aggressive financial gamble in the scorching Persian desert forever altered the complex Middle Eastern geopolitical landscape. These massive multinational corporations wield immense, highly unprecedented global power that often rivals sovereign governments entirely. Their deeply calculated corporate decisions actively affect the daily lives of billions of global consumers continuously. The highly combustible fuel they aggressively extract actively powers global trade and massive international commerce continuously. The immense, heavily concentrated wealth generated from these massive operations remains absolutely staggering to comprehend historically. As global climate policies rapidly evolve, the massive oil giants must continuously adapt to survive financially. The massive, highly complex global energy transition will heavily define the future global economic landscape entirely. The intricate, deeply competitive relationship between private capital and global energy remains remarkably consistent throughout history. The massive global demand for reliable power instinctively seeks out the highest possible return on corporate investment. The moral implications of aggressive fossil fuel extraction are completely sterilized by complex global market mechanics. The incredible distance between the corporate boardroom and the environmental consequence creates a deeply convenient disconnect. Corporate executives actively manage massive quarterly earnings reports rather than the devastating physical global climate consequences. The ongoing, highly aggressive privatization of global energy resources is the established standard of modern capitalism. The ambitious, highly ruthless companies that actively fueled the great nations built the complex foundations of today. Their incredible, massive financial success proves that reliable energy is arguably the most profitable global industry. The modern energy technologies will inevitably change, but the extremely lucrative business of global energy will endure. The relentless, highly profitable cycle of massive extraction and subsequent consumption appears absolutely unbreakable historically entirely. As long as humanity demands power, the massive corporate energy machine will continue to thrive effortlessly. Understanding this complex financial architecture is completely essential to truly understanding modern global geopolitics and economics. Society must actively recognize the massive economic incentives that actively perpetuate endless, highly destructive resource extraction. The detailed, massive balance sheets of modern energy contractors tell a much darker story than traditional history. Historical analysis will continuously uncover the powerful financial forces that quietly shape our modern global reality entirely. To uncover more untold histories of wealth and power, please subscribe to Market Legends right now.